What do these cells have to do with the history of cancer research, and why is it such a tragic story? There's a fairly decent chance that you did not learn about this woman in school. Join me as I talk about the life, tragic death, and eventual immortality of Henrietta Lacks. Imagine a woman whose cells have been to space, cloned countless times, and are found in nearly every biological research lab worldwide. Now imagine that this woman, Henrietta Lacks, never knew any of it. Henrietta Lacks began her life in Roanoke, Virginia as Loretta Pleasant in 1920, although it isn't exactly known how her name changed from Loretta to Henrietta. She would eventually migrate to Turner Station, Maryland, where she worked the tobacco fields. She would eventually marry David Lacks, and they would have 5 children together. Henrietta gave birth to her last child at Johns Hopkins Hospital in November of 1950, just 4.5 months before she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. In January 1951, Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, which was the only one in the area that treated black patients, because she felt a knot in her womb. She had previously told her cousins about the knot, and they assumed correctly that she was pregnant, but after giving birth to her final child, Joseph, she suffered a severe hemorrhage. She would eventually have a biopsy of the mass found in her cervix. Eventually, Lacks was told that she had a malignant epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix. In 1970, physicians discovered that she had been misdiagnosed and actually had an adenocarcinoma. This was a common mistake at the time, and the treatment would not have differed. Lacks was treated with radium tube inserts and discharged a few days later with instructions to return for x-ray treatments as a follow-up. During her treatments, 2 samples were taken from Lacks' cervix without her permission or knowledge. One sample was of healthy tissue, and the other was cancerous. These samples were given to George Otto Gay, a physician and cancer researcher at Johns Hopkins. The cells from the cancerous sample eventually became known as the HeLa Immortal cell line, a commonly used cell line in contemporary biomedical research. On August 8, 1951, Lacks, who was 31 years old, went to Johns Hopkins for a routine treatment session and asked to be admitted due to continued severe abdominal pain. She received blood transfusions and remained at the hospital until her death on October 4, 1951. It's important to note that Henrietta never gave permission for her cells to be harvested, nor was her family informed until many years later, even though it led to the most important cancer research discovery in history. George Gay, the researcher who was studying Lacks' cancerous cells, observed that these cells were unusual in that they reproduce at a very high rate and could be kept alive long enough to allow more in-depth examination. Until then, cells cultured for laboratory studies survived for only a few days at most, which was not long enough to perform a variety of different tests on the same sample. Lacks' cells were the first to be observed that could be divided multiple times without dying, which is why they became known as Immortal. After Lacks' death, Gay had his lab assistant take further HeLa samples while Henrietta's body was at Johns Hopkins autopsy facility. Gay was able to start a cell line from Lacks' sample by isolating one specific cell and repeatedly dividing it, meaning that the same cell could then be used for conducting many experiments. They became known as HeLa cells because Gay's standard method for labeling samples was to use the first 2 letters of a patient's first name and last names. Reproducing Lacks' cells has led to many medical breakthroughs, such as the polio vaccine, research into whether cancer can be transmitted, and cancer immunity. There's been research into the effects of radiation and toxins on human cells, AIDS research, and so much more. In fact, there are 11,000 patents based on Henrietta Lacks' cells. And remember, this was all done without her permission. Lacks' family didn't discover that Henrietta's cells were being used for research until 1975, and it was almost entirely by chance. Before that, they were baffled as to why researchers were trying to get cell samples from them. Unbeknownst to the family, researchers wanted to know if there was anything special in the family's DNA. Over the decades, billions of dollars have been generated from the HeLa cells, although Henrietta's family remained poor. Finally, in October 2021, Lacks' estate filed a lawsuit against Thermo Fisher Scientific for profiting off the HeLa cell line without Lacks' consent, asking for the full amount of Thermo Fisher's net profits. On July 31, 2023, Thermo Fisher Scientific settled with the Lacks family on undisclosed terms. I hope that this video will encourage you to look into the life and history of Henrietta Lacks. I've really only scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn, and it's truly an interesting story. So as always, thanks for watching, and don't allow history to be erased. I'll see you next time.